Verena Holt set her mother's wooden ledger box down on the auction stage and stood up straight while a banker in a gray coat told a laughing crowd that the costly Dutch girl would ruin any man fool enough to take her. By the first frost of that year she would own every acre of the ranch they meant her to break, and the men who priced her like spoiled grain would learn that worth is not weighed on a scale. It happened on a cold, bright morning in the town of Hollis Bend, in the high, dry country, where the Wyoming grass had not seen rain in 9 weeks. Verena was 26 years old. She wore a plain blue work dress let out twice at the seams, and her fair hair was pinned in a flour-dusted bun that had come loose at the temple. She held the ledger box against her hip the way another woman might hold a child, and she did not look down, though every face in the square was tilted up at her like she was a curiosity in a traveling show. The banker's name was Augustus Pell. He owned the bank, the feed store, and half the paper in the county, and he wanted everyone to know it. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage with the slow ease of a man who had never once been told no, and he laid a soft white hand on Verena's shoulder, as though she were a fence post he was selling along with the rails. "Friends," Pell said, "you all know the Holt girl. Eats like 3 hands and works like none." A few men by the rail laughed. Pell smiled at the laugh, warmed by it, a stove-fed kindling. "Her uncle owes me a debt he can't pay, and rather than see the man jailed, I've offered to clear it the Christian way. Whichever rancher takes her off our hands gets a wife, a cook, and my goodwill at the bank. Now who'll be generous?" Nobody answered. The wind moved a loose shutter on the dry goods store, and that was the only sound. Verena kept her eyes on the far hills where the heat sat in a brown haze, and she breathed slow, and even, because she had decided 2 nights ago, alone in her uncle's cold pantry, that she would not give Hollis Bend the gift of her tears. Her uncle, Lyle Mott, stood at the edge of the crowd in his good hat, not meeting her eye. He had taken her in 3 winters, back when her parents died of the fever, taken her in, and then begun, almost at once, to talk about how much she cost. He counted her bread. He counted her cloth. He had told the whole town she ate the profit off his table, and the whole town had nodded, because it was easier to believe a fat girl was greedy than to believe a grown man had gambled his crop away on cards in the back of the saloon. "Come now," Pell called out, sweeping his hat at the square. "A strong back, a clean kitchen, reeds and ciphers, though what use that is in a woman I couldn't say." More laughter. Surely some lonesome fellow will do his duty. Still no one spoke. And Verena, who had spent her whole life being talked over, said the first thing into that silence. "My uncle's debt is $41, she said. Her voice was low and clear and carried farther than she expected. "I know because I keep his book." "He told you 60. The square went still in a new way. Pell's smile did not move, but something behind it cooled. He looked at her as a man looks at a door he thought was locked and just heard rattle. "The girl's confused," Pell said smoothly. "I'm not," Verena said. Page 11. "I wrote it in myself." It was at that exact moment that a wagon came up the road from the south, and the crowd turned to look at it, glad of somewhere else to put their eyes. The wagon was a buckboard, paint long gone, pulled by 2 horses that had seen better feed. The man driving it was tall and lean, in a brown wide-brim hat gone shapeless at the crown, a faded vest, and a cream shirt washed thin. He had a short dark beard and a face that had been weathered hard and young, and he held the reins in hands that were scarred across the knuckles. He pulled up at the rail, set the brake, and looked at the stage with no expression at all. "Crane," somebody in the crowd murmured, and the murmur ran outward fast. "It's Silas Crane." Verena did not know the name yet, but she watched the change come over the square, the small backward lean of bodies, mothers finding their children's shoulders, and she understood that the man in the brown hat was somebody they were afraid of, or somebody they wanted to be. Pell recovered first. He came down a step, all warmth again. "Silas Crane," he said, loud and pleased, "as I live and breathe. You've got a ranch out on the sweetbed, with no woman in the house, and a mortgage at my bank you're 3 payments behind on. I'd say Providence sent you." Silas Crane looked at the banker for a long moment. Then he looked at Verena. He did not look at her body, or not only at her body. He looked at the ledger box on her hip, and at her steady eyes, and at the loose strand of hair the wind kept laying across her cheek. "What does she cost?" Silas said. It was not really a question. His voice was rough and used up, like a road in dry weather. "Clear the Mott debt, and she's yours," Pell said. $41. It went very quiet, because Pell had just said 41, in front of the whole town, after telling them 60. He realized it a half-second too late. Verena did not smile. She only stood a little straighter. "I'll pay the 41, Silas said. He swung down off the buckboard. The crowd parted for him without being asked. "And I'll marry her this morning, if the preacher's sober." A woman near the front made a small scandalized noise. A man laughed and was hushed. Lyle Mott, the uncle, finally lifted his head, and on his face was not relief, but a flicker of something meaner. Surprised that anyone would pay even that much. Pell, watching all of it, began very slowly to smile, and his smile this time was real, and it was the worst thing Verena had seen all morning, because she did not yet know why a banker should be glad to lose a girl he'd just sold for $41. She would learn. By nightfall she would understand that Augustus Pell had not lost anything at all. That he had been trying for a year to break Silas Crane and take the Sweetbed Ranch for a song, and that he had just found a way to do it that cost him nothing and made him look kind. A wife in a hungry house, another mouth on a failing place, a woman the whole county already believed would eat a man poor. Pell did not need to foreclose. He thought he had only to wait. He thought wrong, but that comes later. Silas Crane mounted the stage. Up close he was younger than the crowd's fear had made him, perhaps 35, and there was a thin white scar through one eyebrow and a tiredness in him that no amount of sleep would fix. He stopped in front of Verena and took off his hat, which surprised her and surprised the crowd more. "Verena Holt," he said. He knew her name. He must have heard it somewhere in the murmuring. "I won't lie to you. I've got a hard place and not much in it. I lost my wife 2 years back, and I've been losing the ranch ever since." He said it plain, like reading a bill. "You'd work. I can't promise you easy. I can promise you I won't raise a hand to you, and I won't let any man in that county do it either." Verena looked at him. She had been ready to be sold. She had not been ready to be spoken to like a person, and it nearly undid her composure more than any cruelty had. She tightened her grip on the ledger box. "I keep a clean kitchen," she said. "I keep a clean book. I don't waste, whatever they told you." She nodded once at her uncle without looking at him. "And I don't cry where men can see." Something moved at the corner of Silas Crane's hard mouth. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of where a smile used to live. "Good," he said. "If you are sitting with this story today, if you have ever stood somewhere and felt the whole room price you and find you wanting, then stay with me to the very last word, because Verena's frost is coming, and it is worth the wait. Take 1 second to subscribe so the people who arranged her sale don't get the last word, and tell me in the comments what town you're listening from tonight, because I want to see just how far Verena Holt's story is going to travel before we're through. They were married 20 minutes later in the front room of the Methodist parsonage, with the preacher's wife as one witness and the preacher's deaf old mother as the other. Verena wore the blue work dress. She had nothing else. Silas had not changed his thin shirt. The preacher, who was indeed not entirely sober, mispronounced her surname twice and called her Verena Crane at the end, and just like that, in the time it takes bread to rise, her whole life had changed hands. Augustus Pell did not come to the wedding. He went back to his bank and pulled the sweetbed file and read it over with a glass of good whiskey, and he made a small mark in his own private ledger, the one he kept locked, and the mark meant, "This one will close itself by winter." He had seen it 100 times. A man behind on his note, a poor harvest, and now a wife the town already pitied him for. Pell did not have to lift a finger. He only had to be patient and look generous while a marriage and a ranch starved together. What Augustus Pell had not counted on, what no man in Hollis Bend had counted on, because not one of them had ever bothered to ask her a single real question, was that Verena Holt could read a balance sheet better than the banker who owned the county, that she had been quietly saving a place from ruin since she was 11 years old, and that the thing they had handed Silas Crane to bury him was the only thing in the territory that could have dug him out. But that morning, riding out of Hollis Bend on the buckboard beside a stranger she had just married, Verena did not feel like anyone's salvation. She felt the eyes on her back until the town was gone behind the rise. She held the ledger box on her knees, and when the last roof had dropped out of sight, she let out one long breath, and she did not cry, and Silas Crane, watching the road, said nothing at all, which was, she would come to learn, his particular way of being kind. The road to the sweetbed ran 9 miles southeast through grass, gone the color of an old lion. Verena watched it pass. She had grown up in a green country. Her mother and father had come from Holland when she was small, and her first memories were of low, wet fields and the smell of rising bread, and this dry, yellow land frightened her with its size. There was so much sky. A hawk hung in it without moving. The horse's feet kicked up dust that hung and did not settle. Silas drove without talking for the first 3 miles. Then, as if it had cost him something to decide, he said, "There's a hand. Del Mosser. He's been with the place since my father's time." A pause. "He won't take to you." "Why?" Verena asked. "Because Pell pays him," Silas said, and then looked like he wished he hadn't. "I can't prove that. But he watches the wrong things, and he's careless with the right ones, and twice now I've found a gate open that I know I closed." He shrugged, a small tired movement. "I keep him because I can't afford another man, and I can't afford to be alone out here either." Verena absorbed this. A spy in the house then, a foreman who answered to the banker who wanted the ranch. She filed it away in the neat back room of her mind, where she kept all the numbers that had to balance. "What's your debt at the bank?" she said. Silas glanced at her, surprised. "That's not your trouble." "It's my house now," she said. "It's my trouble." He was quiet a moment. The wheels creaked. $812, he said finally, low, as if the number were a wound he didn't show people. Notes due in full by the spring thaw, year after this. Pell calls in a payment of $200 each fall. I've missed the last 3 falls. He's let it ride. His jaw tightened. Men say he's being kind. He's not being kind. He's letting the interest grow, so the whole thing's worth more when he takes it. How many cattle? 110 head, give or take, down from 400. I sold the rest in the dry years to make payments. He said it flat, but Verena heard what it cost. A man selling off his herd a piece at a time, like selling off fingers. If we ship 80 steers fat in the fall and the price holds, I make the 200 and have a little over. If the price drops, or the grass fails, or we lose cattle to the dry, he stopped. Then I don't. Verena did the arithmetic without meaning to, as naturally as breathing. 80 steers. The fall price. The freight to the railhead. The cost of the hands to drive them. 200 to Pell, the rest to live on through a winter. It was thin. It was so thin you could read a newspaper through it. But it was not impossible, and she had spent her whole life finding the half-inch of daylight in things that looked closed. "Show me your books when we get there," she said. Silas almost laughed. It came out as a single rough breath. "There's no books to show," he said. "There's a coffee can with the bills in it, and a tally I keep in my head." Verena turned and looked at him fully then. This lean, tired man, who had paid $41 for her and married her despite a town, and she felt the first small, unfamiliar warmth of being needed for the one thing she had always been mocked for being good at. "Then I'll make you books," she said. The Sweetbed Ranch sat in a shallow bowl of land with a creek running through it, running thin. That year, a trickle where there should have been a flow, and a stand of cottonwoods gone gray-green at the water's edge. The house was a low log cabin with a sod roof and a stone chimney, 2 rooms, a lean-to kitchen at the back. There was a good big barn, better than the house, as cattlemen build. A corral. A bunkhouse with 1 man in it. A garden plot gone to weeds, where a woman had once kept it, 2 years dead now. It was not a poor place by its bones. It was a place that had been loved, and then had begun, slowly, to die, as a body dies when the heart goes out of it. Verena saw all of it in one long look, and she did not see a ruin. She saw work. She had a great gift for seeing work where other people saw a lost cause, and no one but her dead mother had ever once called it a gift. Del Mosser came out of the barn as the buckboard pulled in. He was a broad man going to fat in the belly, with a wet pink mouth and small eyes, and he stopped dead when he saw Verena on the seat and let his eyes travel up and down her once. Slow, a deliberate look meant to make a woman feel watched. "Lord help us," Del said, and grinned. "What'd you do, Crane? Buy the whole bakery?" Silas was off the wagon and across the yard before Verena had finished gathering her skirt. He did not raise his voice. He stopped a foot from Del and said something too low for her to hear, and whatever it was, the grin went off Del Mosser's face like water off a hot griddle. Del stepped back. He touched his hat at Verena, sullen, and went back into the barn. "I told you," Silas said when he came back to help her down. "He won't take to you." "I've been not taken to before," Verena said, and put her hand in his, and got down off the wagon onto the land that would, by the first hard frost, be hers entirely, though neither of them could have believed it then. That first afternoon, she walked the whole place while Silas saw to the horses. She walked it as her father had taught her to walk a thing before you judge it. Slowly, touching, counting, she put her hand on the barn timbers and found them sound. She knelt at the garden plot and worked the dead soil through her fingers and found it good under the weeds, only thirsty. She walked the creek a 1/4 mile up and a 1/4 mile down and saw where the bank had caved and the water spread thin and useless into a marsh of cracked mud instead of running deep where the cattle could reach it. She saw a dozen small things going wrong that no single one of them would kill the ranch, but all of them together were bleeding it slow. And she saw the cattle, scattered up the dry draws looking for grass, ribs starting to show. 110 head, Silas had said. She counted what she could see from the rise and made it 94, and made a note in her head to count them properly, because a man who keeps his tally in his head loses cattle and never knows it. And a foreman who answers to the bank could lose them for him on purpose. When she came back to the house, the sun was going down red through the dust, and Silas was sitting on the cabin step with his hat off and his head in his hands, not because he was weeping, she understood, but because he was tired in the place past tired, and he had not expected to bring a wife home to all this shame. Verena went past him into the lean-to kitchen. It was a wreck of a kitchen, a bachelor's kitchen, 2 years without a woman, with a fine cast-iron stove gone gray with neglect, and a flour barrel half full of weevils, and a few withered potatoes. But there was flour. Under the weevils there was good flour, and there was lard, and there was a little salt, and there was a stove, and Verena Holt had never in her life needed more than that to begin. She found her mother's wooden ledger box where she'd set it on the table, and she opened it, and inside, under the worn leather book and the stub of pencil and the few coins, was her mother's recipe card, soft as cloth from 40 years of hands, tied with a single faded blue ribbon. Her mother had carried that card from Holland, across an ocean, and half a continent. It was the bread that had fed Verena's whole childhood. She did not need to read it. She knew it as surely as her own pulse. She lit the stove. She sifted the weevils out of the flour by hand, patient, in the failing light. And she began, in a dead woman's kitchen on a dying man's ranch, to make bread. The smell of it filled the cabin before the loaves were half done. It came up out of the stove and crept into the front room where Silas Crane still sat with his head in his hands, and it reached into him and took hold of something he had buried 2 years deep. It was the smell of a house with a woman in it. It was the smell of his mother's kitchen when he was a boy, and his wife's kitchen in the good years before the fever took her. And it was so unexpected and so complete that for a long moment he could not move at all. When Verena came to the doorway to call him to supper, she found him standing in the middle of the front room, with his hat in his hand, just standing, looking at nothing. And she understood without being told that the smell of baking bread had hit him like a blow. "It's only bread," she said quietly, to give him a way out of it. "It's not only bread," Silas said. His voice had gone rough in a different way. He did not look at her. He looked at the stove behind her, at the gold light of it. "There hasn't been bread baked in this house since." He stopped. He put his hat back on, which was a thing he did, she would learn, when he needed a wall between himself and a feeling. "Since a while," he said. They ate at the table by lamplight, the two of them, with Del Mosser taking his plate out to the bunkhouse the way he did, glad to be away from her. Verena had made the bread and fried the withered potatoes with the last of an onion she'd found sprouting in the corner. And she had cut the bread thick and laid the butter she'd churned from the one cow's milk that afternoon, working it cold in a bowl with 2 spoons, because there was no churn. It was a poor meal. It was the best meal Silas Crane had eaten in 2 years, and he ate it slowly, and he did not say so, but he had a 3rd slice of the bread, and then a 4th. And when there was 1 slice left, he pushed the plate toward her, and that, from a man who had paid $41 for her and meant to work her like a hand, was a kind of speech. "My mother brought that bread from the old country," Verena said. "It's the one thing I have of hers. Her card's in my box, with a blue ribbon round it." She did not know why she told him. Perhaps because he was the first person in 3 years who had eaten her cooking without first commenting on how much of it she must eat herself. She always said, "Good bread can hold a house together when nothing else will." Silas was quiet. Then he said, "My wife couldn't bake to save her life." It came out of him sideways, as grief comes in men who haven't been allowed to set it down. "She tried. She'd laugh at it. We'd eat it anyway." He looked at his hands. "Sarah. Her name was Sarah." "That's a good name," Verena said. "It was," Silas said, and the past tense sat in the room with them like a 3rd person at the table, and Verena did not try to move it. She had learned, burying her own mother and father, that you don't move another person's grief. You set a place for it, and you let it sit, and after a while it learns to eat quietly and not take up the whole table. That night she slept in the second room, on a tick of straw she had aired and beaten herself, and Silas slept in the front room by the stove, and the marriage stayed a word and not a fact, which suited her. Because she had married a stranger, and meant to learn the man before she let herself feel anything about him. But she lay awake a long while listening to the dark, and she thought not about Silas Crane and not about Augustus Pell, but about the cattle she had counted wrong, and the creek caved in at the bank, and the $812, and somewhere in the doing of that arithmetic, which was the nearest thing she had to prayer, Verena Holt fell asleep. She was up before light. By the time Silas came out yawning into the gray dawn, there was coffee made, and bread toasting on the stovetop, and Verena was sitting at the table with the coffee can of bills spread out in front of her, sorted into neat stacks she'd weighted down with stones, and her mother's leather ledger open to a fresh page, and the stub of pencil in her hand. "What are you doing?" Silas said. "Making you books," Verena said, without looking up. "Sit. Drink your coffee. I have questions and you're going to answer them, and some of them you're not going to like." He sat. He was too surprised not to. For the next hour, while the light came up gold and hard over the dry hills, Verena Holt took the dying Sweetbed Ranch apart on paper. She asked him the price he'd gotten for steers each of the last 3 falls, and wrote it down. She asked him the freight to the railhead, and the cost of the drive, and the wage he paid Dell, and the cost of the salt, and the seed, and the few dry goods he bought on account at Pell's store. She asked him what Pell charged him at the store, and when he told her, she went very still. And then she wrote it down without a word and made a small mark beside it that meant come back to this. She asked him about the water rights on the creek. She asked him whose land lay upstream. She asked him about the marsh where the bank had caved, and whether it had always been so, and he told her no. It had broken in the flood 3 springs back, and he'd never had the men or the time to mend it. She asked him how many cattle had died in the dry years, and how many had simply gone missing, and at that question he frowned and said missing wasn't a thing he tracked. "You should," Verena said. "I counted 94 head yesterday from the North Rise. You told me 110. Silas set down his coffee. "You can't count cattle off a rise. They scatter. I counted what I could see, and I'll count the rest today, head by head, and I'll write down every brand and every notch," Verena said. "And then you'll know, as a man ought to know, exactly what he has, and exactly what he's losing. You can't save a thing you won't look straight at." She tapped the ledger. "Pell knows exactly what you have. That's why he's winning. The only way you beat a man like that is to know your own house better than he knows it." Silas looked at her across the table for a long moment, and something shifted behind his tired eyes, some old shut door easing open a crack. He had married her to spite the town and to have a cook, and because, if he was honest, in the dark of his own heart, he could not stand the dead quiet of that house one more winter alone. He had not expected this. He had not expected the costly Dutch girl the whole county pitied him for to sit at his table in the dawn and see his ruin clearer than he saw it himself, and lay out a road through it in a hand as neat as print. "All right," he said slowly. "Count them." She counted them. It took her 3 days, on foot and on the back of the gentle old mare Silas lent her, working up every draw and along the creek and into the cottonwoods, and she wrote down every head, every brand, every notched ear in her mother's book in a column straight as a fence line. And when she was done, she came to Silas in the barn at dusk and laid the book open on the workbench under the lantern and put her finger on the number at the bottom. 81, she said. You have 81 head, Silas, not 110. 29 head are gone. Silas stared at the number. The color went out of his face and then came back into it darker. 29 head. In the fall, fat that was, he did the arithmetic the slow way, as he did everything with numbers, and Verena watched him reach the figure she'd already reached. That was near $500 of cattle. That was more than half his debt to Pell. Walked off the place while he kept his tally in his head and trusted a foreman the banker paid. Some die, he said, but he didn't believe it even as he said it. Some get into the breaks, and the cats get them. Some get driven off in the dark by a man who leaves gates open, Verena said quietly. I'm not saying it's so. I'm saying the number says it might be, and a man who knows his number can set a watch and find out. A man who keeps it in his head just gets poorer and calls it bad luck. Silas Crane stood very still in the lantern light. Out in the yard, Del Mosser was singing something tuneless to himself, comfortable, careless, a man who had no idea that the fat girl from the auction stage had just done in 3 days what no one had done in 2 years, looked straight at the ranch, and counted it true. Don't say anything to Del, Verena said. Don't change a thing he sees. Let him think nothing's different. The worst thing you can do to a careless man is let him stay comfortable while you start watching. Silas looked at her, really looked, as a man looks at a tool he'd taken for a trinket and just found could cut. Where did a baker's girl learn to think like that? He said. I told you, Verena said. I keep books. You'd be surprised what a book tells you about people once you stop being afraid of the numbers. She closed the ledger gently over the blue-ribboned card and held it against her hip. My father gambled. My mother kept us alive on what was left, and she taught me the only thing that ever kept a poor, honest house standing. Know your number, waste nothing, and never let the man who's cheating you see you counting. That was the end of the first week. In the second week, the mockery began in earnest, because word had gone around Hollis Bend that Silas Crane had married the fat Holt girl off the auction block, and a thing like that does not stay quiet in a small town. Riders began to find reasons to pass by the sweet bed. A neighbor or two came on a thin excuse to borrow a tool and stayed to look at her. And on the next Saturday, when Silas had to go into town for nails and salt and to make the show of being seen so Pell wouldn't think he was hiding, Verena went with him, because she had decided she would not be a thing that hid. They came into Hollis Bend at midday, and the street was full. Verena climbed down off the buckboard in her blue dress with her chin level, and she heard it start before her feet touched the ground, the murmur, the small laughs, a woman behind a fan, a knot of men outside the saloon. There she is, one of the men said, not bothering to lower his voice. He was a young rancher named Cobb Tillery, handsome and stupid, with money behind him and nothing in front. Crane's bargain bride. $41. He overpaid by 40. The men laughed. Verena did not stop walking. She crossed to the dry goods store with her basket on her arm and her list in her head, and she heard Cobb Tillery call after her, "Hey, sweetheart, you eat the wedding cake or wear it?" And a great roar of laughter went up, and a flush came into her face that she could not stop. But she did not turn around, and she did not slow down, because she had been doing exactly this since she was a girl, and she knew the one thing they could not stand was for it not to land. What she did not see, because she would not turn around, was Silas Crane crossing the street. He came across slow, and he came across quiet, the way he did everything, and the laughter died as he came, just as it had died in the square the day he'd ridden in. He walked up to Cobb Tillery, and he did not raise his hand, and he did not raise his voice. He stood close, as he'd stood close to Del and he said, loud enough for the men around to hear but not the whole street, "You'll speak to my wife civil, Tillery, or you won't speak. Your choice." Cobb Tillery was young and had money and 3 friends at his back, and he made the mistake young men with money make. He laughed. "Your wife," he said. "Crane, you didn't get a wife, you got a—" He never finished it. Silas did not hit him. Silas simply took one more step into the space a man keeps for himself and looked at Cobb Tillery with his tired, flat eyes. And whatever Cobb Tillery saw in them, it was enough, because the word died in his mouth and the color left his face, and he stepped back and found his friends had stepped back too, and the whole thing folded like a bad hand of cards. Silas held his eyes a moment longer. Then he turned and walked to the store, and he held the door for Verena, who had stopped in the doorway and seen all of it. "You didn't have to do that," she said, low, when they were inside among the barrels and the smell of leather and coffee. "No," Silas agreed. He picked up a paper of nails. "I didn't." And that was all. But Verena understood it. He had not done it because he had to. He had done it because somewhere in the first week, between the bread and the counting of cattle, the costly Dutch girl had stopped being a bargain he'd struck to spite a town and started being his wife, in the one way that mattered to a man like Silas Crane. She was his to stand for, and he would stand for her, and the county could laugh at that too if it liked. Augustus Pell watched the whole thing from the window of his bank across the street, and Augustus Pell did not laugh. He had expected the marriage to shame Silas and starve the ranch. He had not expected Silas Crane to cross a street for the woman. A man with something to protect is a harder man to break than a man with nothing left to lose, and Pell, who understood ruin as well as Verena understood bread, felt the first small cold draft of a plan going wrong. He turned from the window and called for his clerk, and he sent for Del Mosser to come into town quiet, after dark, as he did when he had instructions to give that didn't bear the daylight. Verena did not know that yet, but she had felt Pell watching from the window. She had a sense for being watched. 3 years of it had grown the sense in her like a callus, and she had marked it, and when she and Silas drove out of Hollis Bend that afternoon with their nails and their salt, she said, almost idle, "The banker watched us the whole time, from his window. He watches everything," Silas said. "He watched you cross the street," Verena said. "And he didn't like it." She turned and looked back at the town dropping behind them. "Silas, the price he charges you at his store. It's near double what they charge anyone else. I checked the shelf prices today while you were at the counter. He's been bleeding you at the store on top of the note. That's not bad luck, and it's not the dry years. That's a man squeezing you on every side at once because he wants you gone." Silas drove a while in silence. Then he said, very low, "Why would a man want a played-out ranch with a busted creek and a half-dead herd?" "He wouldn't," Verena said. "Not for what it is. For what it could be." She had been thinking about this for 3 days, ever since she'd walked the upstream land. Whose ground is above yours on the creek, Silas? Who holds the water before it gets to you? Silas frowned. The old Greer place. It went back to the bank 2 years ago, when Greer died. Pell holds it. He stopped. She watched him reach it, the slow, careful way. Pell holds the land above mine, and the railroad's coming up the valley inside 2 years, Verena said. I heard the men talking about it at the store. A spur line. If a man held the water, held your creek, and the ground above it, and the ground below, and if the railroad came, she let it sit. Silas, your dying ranch isn't dying ground. It's the keystone of a water empire, and the only thing standing between Augustus Pell and a fortune is you. $800 behind on a note, with a wife the whole county thinks will eat you poor. She looked at him steadily. He didn't sell me to you cheap, because he's kind. He sold me to you cheap, because he thought I'd be the last weight to sink you. He didn't lose $41 that day. He thought he bought your ranch for it. The buckboard creaked on through the gold afternoon. A meadowlark sang somewhere out in the grass, and Silas Crane, who had spent 2 years thinking he was simply a man with bad luck and a heavy heart, felt the whole shape of his ruin turn over and show him its other face, the face that had a name on it, and the name was Pell. "What do we do?" he said, and it was the first time he had said "we" to her, and Verena heard it and held it. "We pay the note," she said. "Every cent, by the spring thaw, so he can't take the Keystone. We ship more cattle than he thinks we have. We get a fair price he can't squeeze. We mend the creek so the herd fattens. We find where the 29 head went and we stop the bleeding. And we do all of it without ever once letting him see us count." She closed her hand over the ledger box on her knees. "He thinks he bought a millstone to hang on you. He bought a bookkeeper, Silas. He just doesn't know it yet." The mending of the creek was Verena's first big work, and she did it the way she did everything, by first sitting down with a pencil and thinking the whole thing through before she lifted a single stone. The water came down off the high ground above the sweetbed, ran clean and good past the old Greer place that Pell now held, and entered Silas's land where the cottonwood stood. There, 3 springs back, a flood had caved the south bank, and ever since, the creek had spread out flat across a low spot and made a shallow, useless marsh, and most of the water that should have run deep on through the home pasture instead lay out in the sun and went to nothing. The cattle had to walk a half-mile down to where it gathered again, and in the dry weeks they walked it thin and lost flesh doing it. A fat steer in the fall begins as a steer that doesn't have to walk for its water. "We dam the spread and channel it back," Verena said, standing at the broken bank with her skirts pinned up out of the mud, sketching it in the air with her hand. "Stone the bank where it caved, here. Cut a channel back to the old run, here. Set the deep water in the home pasture where the herd can reach it without walking off their flesh. It's 2 weeks of work for 3 men, and we have 2. We have 1.5, Silas said dryly, meaning Dell, and the half won't lift a stone he isn't watched lifting. Then it's 2 weeks of work for 2, Verena said. And I'm the 3rd. And she bent and lifted a stone that would have given a strong man pause, and set it on the broken bank, and looked at her husband, and Silas Crane, who had spent a lifetime being told what a woman could and couldn't do, picked up the next stone and said nothing, which was again his way of saying everything. They worked the creek for 12 days. Silas and Verena did the most of it, and Dell did what he was made to do under Silas's eye, and slacked the moment that eye turned, and Verena marked that too, in the back room of her mind, how Dell's hands went slow whenever a job mattered. They stoned the bank. They cut the channel with mattock and shovel, the 2 of them, and Verena's soft hands blistered and split and healed into something harder, and her back ached in the night, and she did not complain, because she had decided long ago that complaint was a luxury for people who had time to be heard. On the 8th day the channel was deep enough to test, and Silas knocked out the last of the old caved bank with a bar, and the creek, freed, came down the new cut with a sound like a sigh, and ran deep and clean across the home pasture for the first time in 3 years, and the 2 of them stood in the mud and watched it run, and Verena, exhausted, laughed out loud, a real laugh, and Silas Crane looked at her laughing and forgot, for 1 whole minute, that he was a ruined man. That night the cattle came down to the new water, and drank and stood in it in the cool of the dusk, the whole 81 head, and they did not walk off their flesh, and Silas sat on the cabin step and watched them and said, more to the dark than to her, Sarah always wanted the creek mended. I never had the time. A pause. 3 years I never had the time. You've been here 3 weeks. You had the time, Verena said gently. You didn't have the heart. There's a difference, and it's no shame. A man grieving doesn't lift stones. He just carries the one he can't put down. She had brought him out a slice of the bread with honey on it, the last of the honey, and she set it beside him on the step. Eat. You worked like 3 men today, and you're built like 1.5. It was a small joke, the first she'd risked with him, and Silas Crane huffed out something that in a less tired man might have been a laugh, and he ate the bread with honey in the dark while the cattle stood in the mended creek, and Verena sat down on the step beside him, not too near. And they watched the herd together, and neither of them said another word. And it was, both of them privately understood, the best evening either of them had had in a very long time. But Augustus Pell had not been idle, and the next blow came on a Wednesday. A man rode out from the bank with a paper, a clerk with a careful face, and the paper said that the Sweetbeds account at the dry goods store was past due, and that no further goods would be advanced on credit, and that furthermore, the bank, having reviewed the note, found it prudent to require the autumn payment of $200 be made not in the fall as had been the custom, but by the 1st of October, a full 6 weeks earlier than Silas had planned, before the cattle could be driven and sold. It was a squeeze, plain and cold. Pell knew the steers could not be shipped fat before the 3rd week of October. He was demanding the money 6 weeks before it could exist, knowing it could not be paid, so that he could call the whole note in default and take the keystone he wanted. Silas read the paper in the yard, and his hand shook with the anger of it, and Verena took the paper from him and read it twice, slow, and then she folded it neatly and put it in her apron pocket and said something that surprised him. "Good," she said. "Good? He's showing his hand," Verena said. "A patient man who's sure he's winning doesn't change the terms. He's frightened, Silas. He saw you cross that street and he saw the creek running, and he heard, somehow, that things are turning here, and now he's trying to grab the ranch fast before it gets strong enough to keep. He's not winning. He's losing, and he knows it, and a losing man overreaches." Her eyes had gone bright and hard, the look of a woman who has just been handed a column of numbers she can make balance. "He wants 200 by October 1st. Then we'll get him 200 by October 1st, and we'll do it in a way that breaks his whole plan. There's no $200 on this place," Silas said. "Not till the steers ship. There's 81 head of cattle," Verena said. "And a creek running. And a barn full of last year's hay we never sold. And a wife who can bake." She was already moving, already counting. "Hitch the wagon Saturday. We're going to town, and we're going to start putting money in this house, and we're going to do it in front of the whole of Hollis Bend, so they can watch the bargain bride they laughed at start to win." What she did that Saturday became, in time, a story they told in Hollis Bend for years, though most who told it got it wrong. She brought bread to town. 12 loaves of her mother's bread, golden and high and smelling of the old country, baked through the night in the cast-iron stove, and a basket of small honey cakes besides. And she set up on a plank between 2 barrels in front of the dry goods store on the public street in her blue dress, and she sold them. She had priced it in her head to the penny, cheap enough that a working family would buy and dear enough to profit on the flour. And the people of Hollis Bend, who had laughed at her 3 Saturdays running, came up 1 and 2 at a time, shy at first, and bought her bread, because the smell of it was the smell of every good kitchen they'd ever known, and because hungry men do not care who bakes the bread, and within 2 hours the plank was bare, and Verena Holt had $4.60 in her apron, and a line of people asking when she'd be back. Next Saturday, she told them. And the one after. Standing order, if you want it. Cobb Tillery did not buy bread. He stood across the street with his friends and watched, and the watching was a sour thing on his handsome face. Because it is one thing to mock a woman who hides, and quite another to mock a woman who stands on a plank in the public street and out-earns your contempt 2 hours at a stretch. And Augustus Pell watched too, from his window, and Augustus Pell understood at once what the bread meant, which was not $4.60. $4.60 was nothing against 800, but something far more dangerous to him. It meant the town was beginning to like her. And a town that likes a woman will not stand quiet while a banker takes her home. Pell made another mark in his locked ledger, and he sent again, after dark, for Del Mosser. The bread money, by itself, would never pay the note. Verena knew that better than anyone she had done the arithmetic, and $4 a Saturday across the weeks left to October came to $40, $50, useful but not the thing. The bread was never meant to pay the note. The bread was meant to do two things, and it did both. It put the town on her side, which she would need before the end, and it gave her a reason to be in Hollis Bend every single Saturday, with her eyes open, near the store and the bank and the saloon and the freight office, listening. Because Verena Holt's true weapon was never the bread or even the books. It was that she listened. And no one watches what they say in front of a fat baker woman selling loaves off a plank. She was invisible to them as servants and fat women and the very poor are always invisible to the comfortable, and she had spent her whole life learning to use that invisibility like a tool. And over the Saturdays of late summer, standing at her plank, she learned the things that would, by the first frost, bring Augustus Pell down. She learned, from 2 freight men eating her honeycakes, that the railroad survey had already come through, and that the spur line was not 2 years off, but 1, and that the survey ran straight up the Creek Valley, straight through the old Greer place and the Sweet Bed both, and that the man who held the water along that line would be made rich beyond a banker's ordinary dreams. That confirmed everything. She learned, from the storekeeper's wife who had grown fond of her, that Augustus Pell had quietly bought up every parcel along the valley over the last 2 years, the Greer place and the Dunmore place and the old mill, all of it taken in default, all but the Sweet Bed, which sat in the middle of the chain like a missing tooth. Pell could not complete his empire without it. The whole valley was worthless to him in pieces, and a fortune to him whole, and Silas Crane's ranch was the piece he could not buy and could not yet take. And she learned on a hot Saturday at the end of August the thing that mattered most. Though she did not understand its full weight until later, she learned it from old Tom Hartley, who had been the county recorder for 30 years, and who came to her plank for honeycakes because his wife was dead and he had no one to bake for him. Old Tom, made loose by the heat and the sugar and the kindness of being talked to, told her, half to himself, that there was an old story about the Sweet Bed water. That Silas Crane's grandfather had filed the first water right on that creek back in the Territory days, the senior right, the one that came before all the others, and that if the papers still existed and could be found, it would mean that the Crane water claim stood ahead of every claim Pell had bought, including the Greer place above it. That, in law, the man who held the senior right held the water of the whole valley, no matter who owned the ground. Course, nobody can find the old filing, Tom Hartley said, licking honey off his thumb. Burned, most likely in the courthouse fire of '71. Pell's lawyer looked. I looked. When Greer died. It's gone. He shook his head. Pity. Whoever had that paper could have named his price for the whole valley. And he took his cakes and went, and never knew that he had just handed a fat baker woman the key to a banker's whole kingdom. If only she could find the lock. Verena drove home that evening very quiet, turning it over. A senior water right, filed by Silas's grandfather. That would put the Crane claim ahead of everything Pell had bought. Gone, they said, burned in a fire. But Verena Holt did not believe a paper was gone just because comfortable men had stopped looking for it. She had spent her whole life finding things that other people had given up on: the half-inch of daylight, the 41 that was not 60, the 29 cattle no one had counted. A paper that valuable would have been kept. A grandfather who filed the first water right on a creek did not lose the paper. He hid it, or he passed it down, or he tucked it somewhere a man tucks the deed to his life. Silas, she said that night, at the table in the lamplight, with the ledger open between them. Your grandfather, the man who started this ranch. Where are his things? Silas looked up, surprised. His things? Papers, boxes, a trunk, anything he left. Where is it? There's a trunk in the loft of the barn, Silas said slowly. Been there since I was a boy. Old papers, my father said. Nothing worth keeping. Just too much trouble to burn. Why? And Verena Holt set down her pencil, and her heart began to beat hard and slow, and she said, because I think your grandfather left you the one thing that can save this ranch. I think it's been sitting in your barn loft your whole life, and I think Augustus Pell would burn this place to the ground tonight if he knew what's in that trunk. They went out to the barn together with the lantern. That very hour, both of them too taut to wait for morning. Silas climbed the ladder to the loft and handed the old tin trunk down to her, heavier than it looked, furred gray with 30 years of dust and hay chaff, and they set it on the workbench under the lantern, and Verena worked the rusted latch with the point of a knife until it gave. Inside were a grandfather's leavings, a folded flag, a daguerreotype of a stern woman in a bonnet, a bundle of letters tied in string, a broken watch, a Bible with a family tree written in the front. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a packet of legal papers, and Verena lifted them out with hands that had begun, very slightly, to shake. She unfolded them under the light. Deeds, the original homestead patent, a bill of sale for the first cattle. And then, near the bottom, a single sheet, brittle and brown, in a clerk's old-fashioned copperplate hand, with a territorial seal pressed dry into the corner, and a date that read 1868, 3 years before the courthouse fire that was supposed to have destroyed it. It was the water right, the senior filing. Elias Crane, the document said, claimed the first and senior right to the waters of the creek then, called Sweetbed Run, for the irrigation and stock watering of his land and all land he might thereafter hold, said claim to stand prior to all claims thereafter filed. Prior to all claims thereafter filed. Verena read it twice, 3 times, her finger under the words, and then she looked up at Silas Crane across the lantern light, and her face was white and shining, and she said, in a voice gone hoarse with the size of it, Silas, he doesn't own the water. You do. You've owned it the whole time. Every drop in this valley, by law, is yours first. The Greer place, the Dunmore place, all of it. Pell's been buying ground that's worthless without the water, and the water is yours, and it's been in your barn loft since before you were born. Silas Crane stood very still, staring at the brittle brown paper in his wife's hands, as if it might vanish if he breathed wrong. Out in the dark, somewhere past the corral, a horse blew softly, and the mended creek ran deep and quiet across the home pasture, his creek, his water, by right, by law, and he had not known it, and a banker in town had built a whole empire on the belief that it was lost. What do we do with it? Silas said, very low. And Verena Holt closed her hand over the paper and held it to her chest, as she had held the debt noticed the day they met. as she held everything that mattered against her heart where no creditor could find it, and she said, "Nothing. Not yet. We tell no one. We let Augustus Pell go right on thinking he's winning. We pay his October 200 to keep the note alive and the ranch in your name, because the day this place isn't yours, the water right dies with it. We ship our cattle, we fatten our herd on our own creek, and we wait. And when Pell makes his move for the whole valley, when he stands up in front of the county, sure he's won. We'll be holding the one piece of paper that says every acre of his empire runs on Crane water. And then, Silas, by the first frost, we won't just save your ranch." Her eyes were bright as struck flint in the lantern light. "We'll own the valley he tried to use me to take." There was a night in early September, before the trap was laid for Del Mosser, when Verena Holt proved herself to Silas Crane in a way that had nothing to do with paper or numbers, and it was the night he first let himself believe she would stay. It began with a cow in trouble. One of the last good breeding cows on the place, a gentle red animal Silas had hand-raised, went down in the dark with a calf turned wrong inside her. And by the time Silas found her in the home pasture, she was far gone, straining and exhausted, her sides heaving, the calf stuck, and the cow weakening fast. Silas knew cattle. He had pulled calves before, but this one was turned the worst way, a leg back, and his big scarred hands were too large for the work, and every minute the cow grew weaker, and he knelt in the dark beside her, knowing he was about to lose them both, the cow and the calf, $200 of his thin future, dying in the grass while he watched. Verena came out with the lantern. She did not ask many questions. She knelt in the wet grass beside the laboring cow and laid her hand flat on the heaving red side and felt, and then she rolled her sleeve to the shoulder and said, "Hold her head. Talk to her. Keep her from rising." And she reached in, her smaller hand finding what Silas's could not, and she worked in the dark and the cold by feel alone, slow and patient, her face gone still and far away with concentration, the way it went still over a column of numbers, and she found the turned back leg and she eased it forward, a little at a time, never forcing, talking low to the cow the whole while in that steady voice that did not hurry. "My mother's people kept dairy cattle in the old country," she said quietly, more to keep the cow calm than to tell him. "She'd have me do this from when I was 9, small hands. She breathed. She worked. There it is. Now when she pushes, the cow pushed, and Verena pulled, steady and even with the rhythm of it, and not against it, and the calf came in a rush into the lantern light, wet and still, and for one terrible moment it did not move. And Verena Holt cleared its nose with 2 fingers and rubbed it hard with a twist of dry grass and breathed into it, and bent and lifted its hind end and let it down, and the small wet thing shuddered and drew a breath and shook its head and lived. She set it by its mother's head, and the exhausted red cow turned and began to lick it, and the calf bawled, thin and outraged at the cold world. And Silas Crane knelt in the wet grass with the lantern guttering and looked at his wife, her sleeve soaked to the shoulder, her arms streaked, her face shining with the work, and he did not say a word, because there were no words in him big enough, but something in his chest that had been shut for 2 years came open all the way, and stayed open. "She'll do now," Verena said. She was breathing hard. She wiped her arm on the grass. "Both of them. Keep her warm tonight, and give her good water. She mended your creek for you. The least you can do is let her drink from it." It was a small joke, and her voice shook on it, because she was tired and cold and full of the strange, fierce gladness of having pulled a living thing out of the dark. And Silas, kneeling there, reached over without thinking and took her cold, wet hand in his big scarred one, and held it, and neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them let go for a long time, while the calf nursed and the lantern burned low, and the new creek ran quiet across the pasture they had saved together. The calf was a heifer, and Verena named her none of the practical things, but a small foolish private name, and Silas pretended not to notice. But he never sold that heifer, not in the leanest part of the winter, and she grew into the best cow on the place, and they kept her all her long life, and she was, in the wordless accounting Silas Crane kept of the things that mattered, the night he stopped thinking of Verena as the woman he had bought and started thinking of her as the woman he could not imagine the place without. Word of that night spread too, as the cattle thief night and the stallion night would spread later, a little at a time through the women of the county, who passed these things hand to hand like men passing news of cattle prices. The storekeeper's wife heard it. The preacher's wife heard it. And one by one, over the weeks of September, the women of Hollis Bend who had laughed behind their fans at the bargain bride began, quietly, to revise their judgment, because a town's men respect courage, but a town's women respect competence, and they had begun to understand that the fat Holt girl was the most competent woman to come into that valley in a generation, and a thing like that, in a hard country, buys a respect that no amount of beauty ever could. The first of them came out plainly, the storekeeper's wife, Hannah Pruitt, on a Sunday afternoon, on the honest excuse of wanting the bread recipe and the truer reason of wanting to know the woman. And Verena, who had been alone among women her whole life, who had eaten at the far end of every table, stood in her own warm kitchen and taught Hannah Pruitt her mother's bread, the blue-ribboned card propped against the flour tin, and the two women baked together in the gold afternoon, and talked the way women talk when they have decided to trust each other. And when Hannah Pruitt drove home that evening, she carried with her 2 loaves and a standing invitation and the firm new opinion, which she shared with every woman she met for a week, that Silas Crane had married the finest woman in the county, and the town had been fools, every one of them, not to see it. So that by the time the killer stallion came down the valley in the storm, the ground had already shifted under Hollis Bend, slow and sure as the season turning. The men had been won by the cattle thieves and the straight true books, and the bread sold off a plank in the public street. The women had been won by the calf pulled out of the dark, and the recipe taught freely in a warm kitchen. And the whole town, without ever quite deciding to, had begun to love the woman a banker had sold for $41 to break a man, so that when the night of the stallion came, and the story of it ran through the valley, it did not fall on hostile ground. It fell on a county that had already, in its slow, hard frontier way, begun to take Verena Holt for its own. Augustus Pell felt the ground shift too, and it frightened him more than any single thing the Cranes had done. He could fight a mended creek and a paid note. He did not know how to fight a town deciding, kitchen by kitchen and corral by corral, that it loved the woman he needed it to despise. And so, in his fear, he reached for the calling of the whole note, the reckless masterstroke that would finish him, and Verena Holt, who had felt the ground shift under her own feet from the inside, who had walked out of being alone and into being loved without ever quite deciding to either, was waiting for him to do exactly that. They told no one. The water right went into the bottom of Verena's mother's ledger box, under the leather book and the blue-ribboned recipe card, the most valuable piece of paper in the territory, hidden under a card that told a poor woman how to make bread. And Verena slept with the box beside her straw tick every night after, and Silas Crane went about his days with a thing inside him he had never had before, which was a future. It changed him. Verena watched it change him over the weeks of September, the way you watch a played-out field come back under good water. He stood straighter. He talked more, a little, in the evenings. He began to fix things he'd let go for years. The corral gate that hung, the loose shakes on the barn roof. Not out of duty, but out of a man's pleasure in mending what is his, and means to stay his. And he began, in small, careful ways, to court the wife he had bought, though neither of them would have called it that. It came out sideways, the way everything in Silas came out. One evening he brought her a handful of late wild plums he'd found in a drawer, and set them on the table without a word, and went back out, and Verena stood looking at the plums for a long time. Another evening he mended the broken churn handle she'd been making do without, whittled a new one to fit her hand, and left it propped by the stove. He never said a courting word. But Verena Holt, who had been mocked and counted and sold and never once given wild plums by a man, understood the language he was speaking, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was beginning to answer it. She caught herself baking him the honey cakes he liked even on days she wasn't selling. She caught herself watching the road in the late afternoon for the sight of him coming in off the range. She caught herself, one night, lying awake on her straw tick in the second room, listening to him breathe by the stove in the front room, and feeling not the loneliness she had carried her whole life, but its opposite. The strange new warmth of being in a house where someone would notice if she were gone. She had married a stranger to escape a worse thing. She had not bargained on coming to care for him. It frightened her more than Pell did. Pell she knew how to fight. This she did not. But there was no time to be frightened, because the work was relentless now, and because Del Mosser was about to make his move. Verena had been watching the foreman all along, quiet, just as she'd told Silas she would, letting the careless man stay comfortable. She had noticed how Del took the night watch on the cattle gladly, when most hands grumble at it. She had noticed how, after his night watches, he was flush with money he had no business having, buying whiskey in town and new boots. She had counted the herd again, secretly, the third week of September, and made it 76. 5 more head gone since August. 5 head walked off in the night, on Del Mosser's watch. "It's time," she told Silas. "We catch him. But we catch him in a way we can use, with witnesses and with the law watching, so that when it comes time to break Pell, we have proof that Pell's own man was stealing your cattle. Del isn't just a thief. He's a thread. Pull him right, and Pell unravels." So they laid a trap, the two of them, at the kitchen table by lamplight, the way they laid everything now. They let it be known, casual, that Silas would be away 2 nights driving a small bunch of culls to a buyer at the next county over, leaving the ranch thin. They made sure Del heard it. And then Silas did not go. He rode out in the morning with the culls, in plain sight, and circled back after dark, and lay up in the cottonwoods by the creek, with a borrowed rifle and the county sheriff's deputy beside him, a young deputy named Cassius Boone, who owed Silas a favor from years back, and who had no love for Augustus Pell, the bank-holding paper on his own father's place. Verena did not go to the cottonwoods. Verena had the harder watch. She stayed in the cabin, alone, in the dark, with the door barred and her mother's ledger box and the rifle's mate across her knees, because if Del meant worse than cattle thieving, if Pell had told him to do worse, with the rancher conveniently away, then the trap had to look complete, and the woman had to look alone, and Verena Holt had decided long ago that she would not ask Silas to risk a thing she would not risk herself. She sat in the dark for hours. The creek ran. An owl called, and a little after midnight she heard what she had been waiting for and dreading, not the soft sounds of a man moving cattle, but the sound of a horse coming in toward the house, and a man's boots on the ground, and the latch of her own door being tried, slow, in the dark. Crane's woman, Del Mosser's voice came through the door, thick with whiskey and something uglier. "I know you're in there, mister. Pell's got a message for you and your fat," he never finished. And he never got the door open. Because, at that exact moment, out by the corral, a shot cracked the night, and a man's voice, Silas's voice, called out hard and clear across the dark. "Hold where you are, Mosser. The deputy's got you cold, and so do I." What had happened was this. While Dell came creeping to the house to frighten the woman, 2 other men had come for the cattle. Hired men Pell had sent up from another county, and they had walked straight into Silas and the deputy in the cottonwoods, and the trap had sprung clean. One of the rustlers had run and been winged in the leg and gone down. The other had thrown up his hands, and Del Mosser, caught between the shot at the corral and the barred door he could not open, did the thing cowards do, which was try to run, and got perhaps 20 feet before young Cassius Boone, deputy of the county, rode him down and put a rope on him in the moonlight. Verena came out of the cabin with the rifle still in her hands and found the yard full of moonlight and men, 2 rustlers down, Dell roped and cursing, Silas walking toward her across the silver grass with the borrowed rifle over his arm and his hat off, looking for her, and when he saw her standing in the doorway whole and unharmed, something went out of him all at once, some terror he hadn't let her see going in, and he crossed the yard fast and stopped in front of her and did not touch her. Because they were not that yet, but he looked at her like a man looks at the one thing he could not have stood to lose. "You're all right," he said. It was not a question. It was a prayer answered. "I'm all right," Verena said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, around the rifle, were not. "Did you get it? Did the deputy hear them say Pell's name?" And Silas Crane laughed, a real laugh, the first full laugh she had ever heard out of him, short and rough and disbelieving, because even now, even in the middle of all this, his wife's first thought was the evidence, the thread, the unraveling. "We got it," he said. "One of them named Pell to the deputy before he knew where he was." Boone wrote it down. Dell's named him too, trying to save his own neck. Says Pell paid him a year to bleed us, leave the gates, drive the cattle off 2 and 3 at a time. It's all coming out, Verena. It's all coming out tonight. The deputy, Cassius Boone, took the 3 of them into Hollis Bend at dawn. Del Mosser and the 2 hired rustlers, roped and sullen in the gray light, and woke the sheriff. And by mid-morning the whole town knew that Crane had caught Pell's foreman stealing Crane cattle, and that the foreman had named the banker, and that there were 2 strangers in the cells who had been hired with bank money. It was not yet enough to take down a man like Augustus Pell, who had lawyers and money and the careful habit of never putting his own hand to a dirty thing. But it was the first crack in the wall, and the whole town saw the crack, and the whole town began, very quietly, to choose a side. Augustus Pell denied everything, of course. He stood on the steps of his bank and told the gathering townsfolk that he was shocked, that a foreman he'd recommended had turned thief, that he had no knowledge of any such thing, that the word of a caught rustler trying to save his neck was worth nothing in law, and in the strict letter of it he was right. Dell's word alone would never hang him. But Pell made a mistake on those bank steps, the mistake of the man who has always won, and Verena, standing at the back of the crowd in her blue dress, with a basket of bread on her arm, saw him make it. He pointed at Silas, across the crowd, and he let his careful mask slip for just one moment, and he said, loud, with real venom, "And as for Crane, a man who can't run his own ranch, who married off the auction block, who's 3 years behind on an honest note, that man comes accusing me? He'll be off that land by spring. Mark it, the bank will have the sweet bed by spring, and good riddance to the lot of them. The bank will have the sweet bed by spring." He said it in front of the whole town, in anger, and the whole town heard the wanting in it. Heard for the first time that the banker wanted the ranch, had always wanted the ranch, and the foreman and the rustlers and the squeeze at the store all rearranged themselves in the townsfolk's minds into one ugly shape. Verena watched it happen on their faces. She watched the town she had been baking bread for all summer turn, slow and sure, against the man in the gray coat. And she said nothing, and she sold no bread that day, and she drove home well satisfied, because Augustus Pell had just done in 20 seconds of temper what no evidence could have done. He had told the truth about himself in public. And a small town never forgets the day it sees a powerful man's true face. "Why are you smiling?" Silas asked her on the road home. "Because he's frightened now," Verena said. "Truly frightened, for the first time. He'll move fast now, because he thinks he's losing. And he's right, and frightened men holding a losing hand make the mistakes that finish them." She looked out at the gold country running by. "He'll call the note hard. He'll try to take the ranch before the truth about him can spread, before the spring, while he still has the law and the paper on his side. And when he does, when he stands up in front of the county to take the sweetbed and finish his empire, that is when we show the water right. Silas, not before. We let him climb all the way to the top of the thing he's built, and then we pull the one stone that holds it up." They lost Del Mosser to the county jail and were a hand short for the fall work, and so the last weeks of September were the hardest yet. The two of them and a single boy they hired off a passing family, doing the work of 4. But the herd was fat now on the mended water, fatter than the sweetbed had shipped in years. 76 head, and every one of them carrying flesh, and Verena had kept the book so tight that she knew to the dollar what the drive would cost and what the steer should bring. And for the first time in 3 years, Silas Crane drove cattle to the railhead, knowing his own numbers. And the knowing made him a different man at the buyer's pen, a man who could not be cheated because he could not be lied to about his own herd. The steers shipped the second week of October, and they shipped well above what Silas had dared hope, because the mended creek had put real flesh on them, and because Verena, who had spent the summer listening at her plank, knew that the Hollis Bend buyer always lowballed the local men, and that there was a fairer buyer 2 stops down the line who would pay top dollar for fat beef, and she had written the man a letter in her clean hand in September and arranged it all, and so the sweetbed cattle went past the cheating buyer entirely and sold for the honest price down the line. When the draft came back, it was for more money than Silas Crane had held in his hand at one time in 5 years, and he laid it on the kitchen table in front of his wife without a word, and Verena counted it, and counted the bills out into stacks weighted with stones, and there, in the middle of October, on a dying ranch that a banker had used a fat girl to try to break, was enough money to pay Augustus Pell his $200 and clear the store account besides, and have a winter's living over, with the whole herd kept and the water running and the truth spreading through the county like the smell of bread through a cold house. "Take it to him yourself," Verena said. 200, in cash, to his face, in front of his clerks. Make him write the receipt in his own hand. Don't gloat, don't say a word more than you have to. Just pay the man, and let him see that the marriage he meant to bury you with is the thing that's keeping you alive." Her eyes were bright. "Let him feel it, Silas. Let him understand, sitting there taking your money, that the fat girl he sold for $41 just paid his October note out of bread and cattle and a mended creek. It'll do more to him than any threat. It'll keep him up at night. And a banker who can't sleep makes mistakes." So Silas Crane rode into Hollis Bend on a bright cold October morning and walked into the bank and laid $200 in cash on Augustus Pell's desk and made him write the receipt and said almost nothing, and Augustus Pell took the money with a face like a man swallowing a stone, because he had been so sure, so completely sure, that the autumn would bring him the ranch in default, and instead it had brought him his own $200 in the hand of a man who had no business having it. And across the lobby, through the window, Pell could see the crane wagon at the curb, and the fat baker woman in the blue dress, sitting up on the seat with her chin level and her eyes on him, not smiling, not gloating, just watching, the way you watch a thing you mean to finish. It was then that Augustus Pell understood, fully, for the first time, that he had not been losing to Silas Crane at all. He had been losing to her. And it was then, in his fear and his fury, that Augustus Pell decided to do the one thing reckless enough to finish himself, to stop being patient, to stop being careful, and to call in the entire note at once. $812, due in full, on a legal technicality buried in the original paper, payable inside 30 days, or the sweetbed forfeit to the bank. He thought it was his masterstroke. He thought no ranch in the territory could raise $800 cash in 30 days in October. He thought he had finally, at the last, won. He had walked, instead, straight into the only trap Verena Holt had been waiting all along for him to spring. The notice came 2 days later, carried out by the same careful-faced clerk, and it was exactly what Verena had predicted. The entire note, called $812, due in full inside 30 days. The sweetbed forfeit to the bank if it was not paid. Silas read it in the yard, and his hand did not shake this time. He had stopped being a man things happened to. He handed the paper to his wife and said, simply, "He's done it." "He's done it," Verena agreed, and there was something almost gentle in how she said it, the way you'd speak of a man who has just stepped off a high place and not yet begun to fall. 30 days. He thinks no one can raise $800 in 30 days in the cold of the year. She folded the notice and put it with the others. And he's right. No one can. "We're not going to raise $800, Silas." She looked at him. "We're going to make him not want it." But before the reckoning with Pell, before the frost, there came one more test. And it was the one that finally turned the whole county, the night of the killer stallion, the night the town stopped laughing at Verena Holt for good. It happened like this. Among the parcels Augustus Pell had bought up along the valley was the old Dunmore place, and on the Dunmore place, in a tumble-down corral, Pell had kept a black stallion, a magnificent, vicious, half-broken animal that had killed one man and crippled another, and that no hand in the county would go near. Pell kept it the way some hard men keep a dangerous dog, for the having of a thing others feared, and he had let it run half wild on the neglected land. And on a bitter night, in the last week of October, with a cold rain coming down and the first ice in the air, the Dunmore corral gave way at last, rotted through, and the black stallion broke loose into the storm. It came down the valley, in the dark and the rain, mad with freedom and fear, and it came, of all places, onto the sweetbed, drawn by the smell of Silas's mares, and it went straight into the home pasture among the cattle and the horses, and turned the whole peaceful herd into a churning terror in the wet black night. Silas was out in it in an instant, on foot in the rain with a lantern that the wind kept killing, trying to turn the panicked cattle before they broke the New Creek bank or ran themselves off a draw, and Verena was out behind him in her nightdress and her husband's coat, and what they saw by the stuttering lantern light froze them both. The hired boy, young Eli, 14, the one good-hearted child they'd taken on for the fall, had gone out ahead of them, brave and foolish, to open the corral and let the trapped saddle horses to safety, and the stallion had come between him and the gate. The boy was down in the mud against the corral rails, where he'd fallen scrambling back, and the great black horse was over him in the rain, screaming, rearing, its hooves coming down a hand's breadth from the child's head, again and again, working itself toward the kill the way a maddened animal does. And there was no time at all, to fetch a rope or a gun or to think. And Verena Holt walked into the corral. Silas shouted her name. The wind took it. She did not stop. She walked into the corral in the rain, in her nitrous, unarmed, straight at the killing animal, and she did the one thing no man in that county would have done, and no man in that county had ever thought a fat Baker woman could do. She did not run at it. She did not shout. She made herself slow, and she made herself low, and she began, in the howling dark, to sing. It was an old song, a Dutch song, the one her mother had sung over the bread and over the cradle, low and steady and strange, and it cut under the wind somehow, the way her mother's voice had always cut under everything, and the great black stallion, mad with terror in a world of howling strangers, heard one thing in all that chaos that was not afraid. One slow, low, unhurried sound coming steadily toward it, and its ears came forward half an inch, and its scream broke off into a snort, and its hooves came down on the mud instead of the boy. Verena kept singing. She kept coming, slow, low, her hand out flat and open, and her eyes down, as her father had taught her to come at a frightened beast when she was a girl in the old country. Never the eyes. Never the front, always the slow, low side, and the steady voice. The stallion wheeled and threatened, and came half down at her once with its teeth bared, and she did not flinch, and she did not stop singing, and behind her in the dark Silas Crane stood with a rifle he could not fire, because his wife was between the gun and the horse, the longest moment of his life, watching her walk unarmed into the thing that had killed a man. And the stallion let her touch it. It came down off its madness all at once, as these things do, shuddering, blowing, soaked black and trembling, and Verena Holt laid her flat open hand on its streaming neck, still singing, and the killer stallion of the Dunmore place stood and let her hold it in the rain. And the boy Eli scrambled free in the mud, and was hauled to safety, and the cattle settled, and the storm blew itself ragged, and when at last the lantern was got lit again, and held up high, the men who had come running from the next ranch over at the noise stood at the corral rails in the wet and the cold, and saw, and did not believe, and never forgot, the fat girl from the auction stage, the bargain bride they'd laughed at all summer, standing in the mud in her nightdress, with her hand on the neck of the horse no man dared touch, singing it quiet, while the rain came down gold through the lantern light. Nobody laughed at Verena Holt in Hollis Bend after that night. The story went through the county in a day, growing as the best stories grow in the telling. And by the end of the week, there was not a man or woman in the valley who had not heard how Crane's wife had walked into the killing corral and gentled the Dunmore devil with a song, and the laughter that had followed her all summer turned, all at once, into something else, into the particular awe a hard frontier holds for courage, which is the only currency it truly respects. Cobb Tillery, who had called her a bargain at $41, came out to the sweet bed himself, hat in hand, to see the horse and to mumble something that was almost an apology, and Verena gave him a slice of bread and said nothing about the street, because she had learned from her mother that the cruelest thing you can do to a man who has shamed you is to be kind to him after you've won. The stallion she kept. It was hers now, the way a thing is yours when you've walked into the storm for it, and it followed her about the place like a great black dog, and it would let no one near it but her. And Silas Crane, watching his wife with the killer horse, finally said the thing he had been carrying since the night of the cattle thieves, the thing he had not had the words for. It was a clear, cold evening at the end of October, the first hard frost just 2 nights off, the sky gone that deep clean blue it gets before real winter, and Verena was at the corral with the stallion in the last gold light, and Silas came and stood at the rail beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then Silas Crane took off his hat and turned it in his scarred hands and said, looking at the horse and not at her, "I bought you for $41 to spite a town." "I know," Verena said. "I'd pay every cent I have in the world to keep you," Silas said. "And I want you to know that's the truth before the rest of it, before Pell and the note and the frost. Because if it all goes wrong and we lose every acre of this place, I'd still rather lose it with you than keep it with anyone else." He turned the hat. His voice had gone rough. "You came here a stranger I'd no right to ask anything of, and you saved a ranch I'd given up on, and you walked into that corral, and somewhere in it he stopped." He was not a man of words, and he had reached the end of his. "I don't want a cook, Verena. I don't want a bookkeeper. I want you, the way a man wants his wife. If you'll have me, if you can, after how you came here." Verena Holt stood at the corral rail with the killer horse's breath warm on her shoulder and the cold gold light on her face, and she did not answer for a long moment, because there was a thing she had to say first, the truest thing she knew, and she had decided she would only ever say it once. "My whole life," she said, "men have looked at me and seen what I cost. My uncle saw it. The town saw it. Pell weighed me on a scale and priced me to sink you. Not one of them ever once looked at me and saw what I was worth." She turned and looked at him then, full, the way she had looked at no one in 3 years. "You did. The first morning, on that stage, you looked at my book before you looked at my body. You've never once, in all this time, made me feel like a burden you bought. You gave me wild plums." Her voice broke, just slightly, on the plums, and she let it, because there was no one here to see her cry but the one person she had decided she could cry in front of. "I came here a thing that was sold. Silas, you're the first person who ever made me feel like a woman who was chosen. So yes, I'll have you. I've had you since the bread." And Silas Crane, the most dangerous man in Hollis Bend, dropped his hat in the mud and took his plus-size wife in his arms at the corral rail in the last gold light of October, and kissed her, and the killer stallion stood quiet and let it happen, and the mended creek ran deep across the home pasture, and somewhere a long way off the first thin edge of the coming frost moved down the valley toward the morning that would change everything. The reckoning came on the 1st of November, the morning after the first hard frost. Augustus Pell had set the day himself. He had given out, in town, that the sweetbed note was in default, which it was not yet, the 30 days not run, but Pell no longer cared for the strict letter of the thing, because Pell was frightened now, truly frightened, and a frightened man who has always won will burn the rulebook to win one more time. He had arranged for the county land agent to come, and the sheriff, and he had let it be known that he meant to take formal possession of the sweetbed and, with it, the last parcel of the valley, and he had asked the railroad's man to be present too, the survey agent, because Augustus Pell meant to stand up that morning in front of the whole county and announce the great thing he had built, the unbroken chain of land along the spur line, every acre and every drop of water in the valley. The empire he had spent 3 years and a banker's whole cunning assembling, and he wanted witnesses to his triumph. He got his witnesses. The whole town came. They came out to the sweetbed on the cold, bright morning, with the frost still white in the shadows, because word had spread that there was to be a reckoning between the banker and the bargain bride, and a small town will not miss a thing like that for any weather. They stood about the yard in their coats, and their breath smoked in the cold. And Augustus Pell arrived in his good carriage, with his clerk and his lawyer, and the land agent, and the railroad man, and he climbed down looking pleased and grave and sure, the way he had looked on the auction stage the morning he sold her. And Verena Holt watched him from the cabin step with her mother's ledger box in her hands, and thought that the whole thing had come full circle, exactly as she had meant it to. Pell did not waste time. He stood in the frosted yard with his papers, and he addressed the crowd as much as the cranes, because the crowd was the point. "I take no pleasure in this," he lied, smooth and grave. "But a debt is a debt. The sweetbed note is in default. By the authority of the bank, I am here to take possession of this property, and to complete at last a work of progress that will bring the railroad and prosperity to this whole valley, a single, unified holding, the finest in the territory, of which this ranch is the final piece." He let his eyes rest on Silas, and then, deliberately, on Verena, and the old contempt came back into them. "I'd hoped the new Mrs. Crane might have softened the blow. Instead, I hear she's been selling bread off a plank and playing at books." Well, a woman's place was never the saving of a ranch. He held out his hand for the deed. "Mr. Crane, the property." And Silas Crane looked at his wife. Verena stepped down off the cabin step into the frosted yard, and she walked to the center of it, where all the county could see her. The fat girl from the auction stage in her blue dress and her husband's coat, and she opened her mother's worn wooden ledger box in front of them all, and she lifted out, from under the leather book and the blue-ribboned recipe card, a single brittle brown paper with a territorial seal pressed dry in its corner, and she held it up in the cold, bright morning light. "Before you take anything, Mr. Pell," she said, and her voice was low and clear and carried to the back of the crowd the way it had carried across the auction square the first morning, "the county should hear about the water." A stillness came over the yard. "This is the original water right to Sweetbed Run," Verena said. "Filed in 1868 by Elias Crane, Silas's grandfather, 3 years before the courthouse fire that everyone supposed had burned it. It is the senior right, the first right. In law, the Crane claim stands prior to every claim filed after it." She turned, slowly, so the whole crowd could follow her, and she looked at the railroad man, and at the land agent, and last of all at Augustus Pell, whose face had gone the gray of old ash. "Every parcel you've spent 3 years buying up along this valley, Mr. Pell, the Greer place, the Dunmore place, the old mill, sits below this creek or beside it. Not 1 acre of it is worth $1 without water, and every drop of that water, by law, by this paper, belongs first and senior to the man you've been trying to break." She lowered the paper. "You haven't been buying an empire, Mr. Pell. You've been buying dust. The water was never yours to take. It's been in this man's barn loft since before either of us was born." The silence broke like ice. The railroad man stepped forward fast, asking to see the paper. The land agent crowded in behind him, old Tom Hartley, the recorder, who was there in the crowd, pushed up to the front and took the brittle document in his trembling hands and read the territorial seal and the date and the copperplate hand. And his old face changed, and he turned to the crowd and said, in a cracked, carrying voice, "It's genuine. I'd swear to it. This is the senior filing. This woman's holding the water rights to the whole valley." And a sound went through the crowd, a long, low, astonished sound, and every face in the frosted yard turned from the brittle paper to the banker in the good coat. And Augustus Pell stood alone in the middle of his witnesses, with his empire turning to dust in front of him, and nothing, for once in his life, to say. It was worse for him than ruin, because it was ruin in public, in front of the whole county he had ruled, at the hand of the fat baker woman he had sold for $41 to do exactly this much damage. The railroad man, who needed the water and now knew who held it, turned his back on Pell on the spot and crossed the yard to Silas Crane to talk terms. The land agent began, quietly, to explain to anyone who'd listen that the bank's parcels were now worth a fraction of what Pell had paid in default and judgment for them, that he'd mortgaged his own bank to buy a valley he couldn't water, that Augustus Pell was, in the space of one cold morning, not the richest man in the county, but very likely the most overextended. And the sheriff, who had come to evict the Cranes, instead found himself listening to old Tom Hartley and the deputy Cassius Boone lay out the matter of the cattle thieves and the foreman's confession and the bank money that had hired them, and the sheriff's face grew long and grave, because a man whose empire has just collapsed is a man whose crimes are suddenly very interesting to look into. Augustus Pell did not pay his witnesses for a triumph that day. He climbed back into his good carriage alone, gray and silent, while the county he had meant to own watched him go. And he was not, in the strict telling of it, ruined that single morning. That took the winter, the calling of his own debts, the railroad buying the Crane water, and going around his worthless dust, the slow public unwinding of every parcel and every default he'd squeezed out of his neighbors. But the morning of the first frost was the morning it turned, and everyone there knew it, and Augustus Pell knew it best of all, and he never again in his life stood up in front of the county sure that he had won. And the $800? The note he'd called in to take the ranch? The railroad paid it, and 10 times more, in the first week of November, for a lease on the senior water right that left every acre of the sweetbed in Silas Crane's name and put more money in Verina's ledger box than her uncle's whole farm was worth. By the first frost, exactly as she had said on that lantern-lit night in the barn, the costly Dutch girl they had, saddled onto a ruined man to bankrupt him, owned, with her husband, every acre of the sweetbed free and clear, the water of the whole valley, and the future the railroad was bringing up the line, and the men who had priced her like spoiled grain on an auction stage lived out the rest of their days in a county that belonged, in every way that mattered, to her. But the owning of acres was never the thing, and Verina knew it, and if you have stayed with her story all the way to this first frost, you know it too. The thing was the kitchen, warm in the early dark, the stove gone gold, the smell of her mother's bread filling a house that had a future in it now. The thing was Silas Crane, coming in out of the cold, and hanging his hat on the peg by the door, and standing a moment, the way he had that first night, just to breathe the smell of a home with a woman in it, except that now the woman was his, chosen and choosing, and the house was theirs free and clear, and the killer stallion stood quiet in the corral. And the creek ran deep across their own pasture under the first white frost. The thing was the blue-ribboned recipe card, set now in a little carved frame Silas had whittled through the long evenings, hung on the kitchen wall above the stove where a poor immigrant woman's bread had held a whole house together when nothing else would, exactly as she'd always said it could. Verina Holt, Verina Crane, stood at her stove in the gold light with the frost coming down outside, and she was not invisible anymore, and she was not for sale, and she had not been chosen for her smallness or her smoothness or for costing a man little, but for everything she truly was: the steady eyes, the straight column of true numbers, the slow low song that gentles a killing thing, the heart that walks into the storm. She had come to that valley a thing that was sold. She left this story a woman who owned every acre she could see, and was loved by the one man who'd had the eyes to see her worth before she'd proven a single ounce of it. And the difference between those two women was not the land, and it was not the money, and it was not even the winning. The difference was that she had finally been believed in. That is the whole of it. That is what the frost brought her. If this story warmed you tonight, if you've ever stood somewhere and felt the whole room price you and find you wanting, and wished, just once, for a frost like Verina's, then tell me about it in the comments. The place where you felt invisible and the day you stopped being invisible. Because I read every single one, and I want to know how far this woman's story has traveled, and how many of you were standing on a stage like hers, waiting to be counted true. Stay warm out there. Keep your number honest, waste nothing, and never let the man who's cheating you see you counting. And when the world tries to weigh your worth on a scale, remember Verena Holt, who they sold for $41 to break a man, and who, by the first frost, owned every acre they'd sworn she'd never deserve.